This is Test J, Section 2, Question 3. The passage says, "A century in certain ways is like a life." Oh, God. Already my eyes are rolling, oh, you're going to compare a century, which is like an arbitrary measure of time. A century, it's like a life. Oh boy, all right. Now they're going to have to tell me why a century is like a life. "And as the end of a century approaches, people behave toward that century much as someone who is nearing the end of life does toward that life." Stop there and predict what you think is going to come next. What do they mean by that? The end of the 20th century came up and everybody started to... What happens? Well, you probably get nostalgic, you reminisce about the stuff that came before, you make a bunch of really annoying top 10 lists, I don't know. All right, so it says in the second sentence, so, by the way, is almost always a conclusion indicator. We can probably say it's always a conclusion indicator. The thing that came before the so is going to be evidence. The thing that comes after the so is going to be a conclusion that they're going to reach from that evidence. And they say, so, just as people in their last years spend much time looking back on the events of their life, people at century's end blank. Well, I've already predicted it, y'all. I didn't even need them to tell me that second sentence. When I read the first sentence, people behave at the end of a century similar to how they behave at the end of a life. Well, it's probably a lot of reminiscing. The second sentence, they give you this, just as people in their last years spend a lot of time looking back on the events of their life, people at centuries end what? Well, I'm looking for an answer that says something like, spend a lot of time looking back on the events of the century. And I'm really not going to accept an answer that says anything other than that. A says, reminisce about their own lives. Absolutely not. No, we're making a comparison here. This is supposed to be a simile, right? Just like people look back on the events of their lives at the end of a life, at the end of a century, they look back on the events of that century, not of their own lives. B, fear that their own lives are about to end. Like Y2K nonsense. C, focus on what the next century will bring. That's just not what we're looking for, guys. We're looking for reminisce on the events of that century. D, become very interested in the history of the century just ending. Not exactly the words I was looking for. History was not something that I was expecting. But if you're looking back at the events of the century, you're looking at the history of the century. D is the best answer by far so far. E, reflect on how certain unfortunate events of the century could have been avoided. That might be something that we look back on 2020 and reflect on different mistakes that have been made. But that's not what we were looking for in this argument. The answer here is D. I think that most of you, if you've been studying with me for any period of time, I think most of you found this question to be pretty predictable. Yeah? Can I get an amen? You guys had an idea what the answer was going to be here? Good. That means you're tuning in. The LSAT is generally easy, and this one, all you had to do is read slowly and carefully and have good reading comprehension skills, which always involve predicting what you think is going to come next. And here, D is, it's not the exact words that I predicted, but it's pretty easy here to choose D.